He did it through simple persuasion, as I'm trying to persuade Brexiteers to stop their evil nonsense. He did the same. I think what happened, there are many legends and scholars to this day are still trying to work out exactly what happened where. I don't think this idea of a confrontation with the Druids could be accurate, because they were the spiritual elders of all of Ireland. I go rather with Joyce, the great scholar who wrote The Social History of Ancient Ireland, Patrick Weston Joyce, who said the Druids accepted the wisdom elements of Patrick's teaching and that of other saints, and they adapted it and moulded it into their own pre-existing body of spiritual knowledge. You see, Kierkegaard writes a wonderful book about becoming a Christian. It's called The Unscientific Postscript, and it's one of the great classics of existential philosophy. He talks about what is the existential experience of becoming a Christian. It's not about, getting your hair cut in a certain way or doing certain rituals or, singing certain hymns and stuff. That's the outer facade. The actual thing is the existential leap that the individual soul makes when it stands before the Creator, born anew into a place of sparkling love, and sees the world in a different way. Reading the Gospels, hearing the story of Christ, learning what he went through, and how much he loved the world, makes you sit up and think, blimey, I've been asleep. I don't love the world half that much, I'm going to get on this team. I mean, that happened to me in my early 20s when I was in Canada. I'd never studied the Gospels, never heard about Christianity. My parents had been humanists and Marxists and much more sophisticated than all that. But, when I actually read them, I thought, blimey, this is actually very interesting. And it made me sit up and reevaluate my life and make a rededication to working for peace through spiritual wisdom and so on and so on. It made my work as a subsequent scholar much deeper, I hope. Well, I went through what Kierkegaard describes, that process of reflection. And I think that's what happened among some of these Druids and the people of Ireland. And Patrick, it had happened to him. So all he had to do was explain, look, this is what happened 300 years ago in Judea. This is this poor innocent guy, Jesus, who we think of as the great teacher, the great rabbi, the Messiah. He was actually crucified and killed because there was an evil and wicked government in power at the time. And, but lo and behold, that evil that had killed him, and it was the Roman Empire that did it. It wasn't the Jews, it was the Roman Empire and some of the lackeys that were supporting the Roman Empire. And at the time it was the Emperor Tiberius who was ruling. So there's this archetypal clash between Tiberius and all he stood for, and this itinerant mystic who's, I think, best represented in the new film on Mary Magdalene. If you watch that film, it's almost as if they had a camera there and they're filming it. It's that realistic. I think the Jesus mission was like in that new movie that's come out. And Mary Magdalene was central to that mission. I want to also remark on a very strange synchronicity and irony of history, because today is also, as well as being St. Patrick's Day, it's also the day of the death of Tiberius, the very emperor in whose name Christ was crucified. And today, the 17th of March, is accepted and known about in history to be the day on which Tiberius finally met his maker. And God knows, what happened there, but I think we can get a picture if we share a little bit about what Tiberius was up to. His predecessor, Emperor Augustus, I mean, I have a problem with emperors generally, but, as emperors go, Augustus is probably one of the better ones that Rome produced. But Augustus married a woman called Livia, which was, I think, a mistake. He forced her to divorce her first husband, who was Tiberius's father. And Tiberius never really forgave Augustus for this. And he then went off and became a general. He was very successful as a general. And eventually, Tiberius was recalled to Rome and declared the successor of Augustus. As Augustus was very old and ill, I think it was a mistake. He chose the wrong man. And one of the problems with imperial systems of power is that so much hangs on the choices of just individuals who make mistakes, frail, mortal, people that get it wrong. And I think Augustus got it wrong. He knew he'd got it wrong, and he said, as he was dying, oh, poor Roman people, to be ground by those slow-moving jaws. Because Tiberius was, apparently, he didn't speak a lot. He was a sort of power freak, you can see him like a mental image of the guy, a typical soldier. In fact, with all due respect, the kind of people that are speaking out in Commons against Brexit, that slow-moving, like, I'm the boss, I'm the Tiberius, do what I say kind of attitude, shocking, really. Anyway, and what happened, he succeeded, he was now 54, became Rome's second emperor. To begin with, he was hard-working. It's not easy being an emperor of a huge empire. He said, being an emperor is as difficult as holding a wolf by the ears. Interesting metaphor, Tiberius obviously didn't like wolves. Wolves are amazing. Why would you want to hold a wolf by the ears? Let it roam free. Also, he'd studied in Rhodes for 5 years in retirement. I don't know what he got up to, but he wasn't reading any books that teach ethics, as far as I can see. He then retired to his villa after 13 years of trying to rule this empire. He retired to his villa in the south, near Naples, at Capri, and he never again visited Rome. He gave power to his commander of his guard, called Sejanus, in Rome. But he didn't relinquish, that was day-to-day running, he didn't relinquish his grips on the overall imperial structure, and it's very probable, almost certain, that the trial of Jesus would have come to his ears, and certainly the appointments of Pilate and all this kind of thing. But he was by then steeped in corruption and evil. There's only one word for it. He would have people hurled off the cliffs of Capri after torturing them. One senator was condemned to death for carrying a coin with Tiberius's head into the lavatory. And he descended into paedophilia and pederasty. His personal, sexual mores were just give me more and give me more and give me more. And he would often have his victims, sometimes children, killed after he'd finished with them. Now this is a very disturbed person. This is a psychic, a psycho, all the stuff on the internet about, people in great power are doing horrible, unspeakable tortures to children. And, Tiberius did that. And he was doing that at the time when Christ started his little wandering mission. I know whose side I'm on, and I know whose side we ought to be on in history. And I thought I knew whose side the British people were on and the European people. You see, the thing is, we chose Christ's path a long time ago instead of the Tiberius path. Tiberius is the malevolent, evil dictator who thinks nothing of other human beings and their lives, and who justifies it because of that, it's my duty, I'm the emperor, throw him off the cliff kind of attitude. He said that it was against tradition to strangle virgins. So when the little girls had to be sentenced to die, which happened on his watch quite a lot, he had their executioners rape them before they were executed. That's Tiberius's idea of ethics, right? And then he did something, where evil is, it tends to accumulate evil, it attracts to itself. His 18-year-old nephew was called Caligula, and he was, at that time, nobody really knew what it was going to be like. And Tiberius brought him to Capri, let him enjoy all the luxuries and all the sexual orgies that were going on. You know, it was like a continual orgy in this place. And then he declared him his successor. And Caligula would grow up and become a much even worse emperor than Tiberius. You know, if you thought Tiberius was bad, and believe me, he was bad, and it's written up by Tacitus and Suetonius, great Roman historians. If you think Tiberius was bad, just wait till you read what Caligula does. You know, it's worse. It's much worse, and unbelievably shocking. And there's things that I know about Tiberius I'm not going to say. They're so disgusting, what he was doing. And eventually he died. He, in fact, having made Caligula his successor, he then went in early 37 AD. So that's probably 4 years, or it's, you know, a few years after the crucifixion of Jesus. It's not exactly known, but possibly 36 AD is when Jesus was crucified. So it'd be the year after. He travelled to Campania to take part in some military games, and he injured his shoulder throwing the javelin and became very seriously ill. Kind of typical, you know, trying to prove that he's a great young warrior, again, ego. He went back to the villa on Capri and lapsed into unconsciousness. And, you know, the doctor said, look, he's not going to last. He's going to die. So Caligula went into the room after, you know, a vigil and slipped the seal ring from the imperial finger. Oh, I'm going to be next emperor. I'll need that, thank you very much. It's a bit like getting the Wi-Fi passwords off you know, your predecessor. But then Tiberius sat bolt upright in bed. He woke up from the coma. He'd only been in a coma. And Caligula was terrified because Tiberius was completely ruthless in having people killed and thrown off the cliff and so on. And it had been going on in Rome, by the way, under his lieutenant Sejanus. He'd been executing anybody that spoke out. I mean, you know, if this was ancient Rome and I'm speaking out against Tiberius, the troops are going to come and arrest me like in 30 seconds. But fortunately, we live in, this is the point about modern European democratic society. We live in a world where I have the right to speak out the truth as a historian, as a scholar, as a philosopher. In Tiberius's reign, he didn't. And that's why Jesus was killed. Yeah? He didn't have the right that we do now. And that's why I'm fighting so hard to keep the European Union and Britain as one happy family, and let those values of liberty of conscience and freedom of speech, let them spread, not let them be cut back. Everything the European Union has in its founding charters and so on is so priceless, and it's so contrary to what you know, other countries and other civilizations and even earlier forms in Europe had, like in the tyranny of the Roman Empire. So let's not let it be stolen from us by people that are you know, basically not people of learning. I will be charitable here. They think, some of them think they're being ethical, and I respect that, and I you know, reserve judgment on the veracity of that. But I think many are very pompous. I think when I look at Rees-Mogg, I see pomposity in every pore of his being, and arrogance based on his ill-gotten wealth. I don't think, I'll be coming to that later, I don't think that his manipulation of the money markets and so on is ethical. I think he's a pompous and avaricious and unethical kind of politician. He should have been on, he probably was on the team of Tiberius in a former life, you know. They act as if they are, and Boris Johnson as well loves these Roman emperors. He thinks he's one too. It's the old Tiberius team. Anyway, what happened is, Caligula takes the seal ring, Tiberius sits up in bed, but before he can do anything, Caligula brings his ally Macro into the room, and he's the commander of the Praetorian Guard, thinks on his feet and smothers the old emperor to death. Oh, what a chaotic scene. And then all hell breaks out, because then Caligula is you know, like a million times worse than Tiberius even. And that was the guy that was running things when the early Christians were trying to organise, and when Mary Magdalene was, trying to cheer up the early disciples, as it says in her wonderful fragmentary gospel that's come down. Like, yes, he's been executed, but he is still with us. He is resurrected. And she was the first to witness the resurrection. This is why we've had this Mary Magdalene Studies Association here in France and internationally. It's the first such thing to have been formed. I think her witness and her role in early Christianity is absolutely vital. And I love the legends that she came to France. It's very possible. Well, she came, at the great cost of her risk to her life. She came at the time of Caligula. And then there was a succession. I mean, just when you think it couldn't get any worse, then there was Nero, who was the next one. And Peter and Paul in Rome were executed by him. These early Christians were like lambs to the slaughter, literally, with the level of evil and corruption that was there. Anyway, as a historian, I'm interested in the archetypal, karmic balancing of history, and that's the perspective I bring to bear on Brexit. I look at, who's the Tiberius here? Who's being the Christian? From the perspective of St. Patrick, he wasn't a learned scholar. He wasn't someone who'd spent years studying, every different religion under the sun. But he was a good man, a virtuous man, who knew enough to know it's not the quantity of what you know so much. It's what you do with what you know. I mean, the person that taught Rudolf Steiner his love of nature and his respect for herbs and herbal medicine was an old Yugoslav peasant he met when it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, who taught him spiritually, to respect nature and what the etheric currents are behind different plants and all that. And that man had no learning, so-called, no official learning. But he had an essence of truth about him. And I think that's obviously what we have with Patrick, and why he succeeded in bringing that news to Ireland. And, so in my work for the Irish Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I'm very much at pains to say that we should go right back to the roots of the Irish civilization, go right back to the wisdom of the Druids, learn about it, study it. It should be in schools. That's embedded in the sacred landscape. When Patrick was very old, it's said, there's a wonderful text that's come down. When he was taken around Ireland by a bard, by a seer, Finn McCool's son, Oisin, apparently, took him around all the magical and sacred sites of Ireland and showed him in the hills, in the landscape, in the forests, in the valleys, which gods and deities lived there. That text has come down to us, or parts of it have, and it's a kind of magical journey. And there's enough evidence to show that Patrick did respect the ancient wisdom of the Druids, actually. And yet wanted to bring in a new kind of type of insight. Well, I think that marriage between the ancient goddess worshipping Druids and the Christ worshipping Christians can be reconciled. In my own work as a theologian and commentator on the New Testament, I tried to show how the ancient goddess traditions of the Hermetic mysteries of Egypt, the Kabbalah, the ancient Jewish mysteries, the mysteries of Enoch, and so on, are 100% in harmony and alignment with the ancient mystery traditions of the goddess culture that I think Christ himself was teaching from. And if you read in the Gospels, you can see that, and that's why Mary Magdalene was so important. She was his goddess on the patrol, so to speak. So anyway, what I want to celebrate this March 17th is the revival and restoration of that primal wisdom, which is beyond labels. I'm not talking, it's not just Druid, it's not just Christian, it's not just Jewish, it's universalistic wisdom that is our birthright as human beings. Once we attain that, we can see through the lies of Brexit, which is all premised on this kind of stiff upper lip duty, military officer, on the job, going to push it through kind of thinking. And also, we can see through the lies and the fear that it's generated by. The fact is that the people that are pushing for Brexit are terrified of everything, actually. A lot of them are great conspiracy theorists. You know, they're terrified of Dracos and underground bases who are running whatever, you know, etc. And terrified of the European Union. It's all full of evil people and so on. That's not what I see when I look at it. That's not what I see when I see the layout of the European Parliament, which is more circular than the UK Commons, which is very combative. We need a new design for the Commons based on the European Union Parliament model, which is a semicircle, where everybody's wisdom can be shared in an egalitarian milieu. So, okay, so I want to also share something which is of interest. I've been writing my book recently, as some of you know, about the true history of 9/11. I'm the first historian with a PhD in history, a proper academic historian, to ever look at the 9/11 problem, which is ridiculous. You know, why should it be down to me? But it is, because I feel it's my duty, because I love the Middle East, I love truth, you know, and so I've gone into, in micro detail over the last 2.5 years, the events of 9/11 from every historical angle and trying to explain what happened. And I'm now writing the second volume, which will be published within maybe 3 months. And I'm looking at the reactions by all world leaders to the events of 9/11. And I'm asking, is it possible this guy or this woman knew in advance 9/11 was coming? Might have they been involved in some way in precipitating it? Because the true facts have never come out. It wasn't just 19 Al-Qaeda people run by Osama bin Laden. That much is obvious to any historian that looks at this in sufficient detail. We have to listen to the building and engineering experts who told us 9/11 Twin Towers were not just brought down by those 2 planes. It's not geophysically possible. Therefore, there has to have been an internal explosion, engineered and pre-wired. The question that I'm looking at is who would have done that? And that's a hugely important question, you know. In the course of that, I'm looking at Georgia, and I'm looking at Sheva Nazi, who was then the ruler of Georgia. And he was the chap who had, with Gorbachev, really brought the Treaty of the Peace of Paris in 1990, which made possible the ending of the Cold War. He was a great statesman and a great man, I think, Sheva Nazi. I think it's very sad that the Treaty of Paris was not really adhered to in letter or spirit by the USA. I think Gorbachev and Sheva Nazi were genuine people. They realised that if there was ever a nuclear war, it would be catastrophic for the planet, that to go on spending billions of rubles and dollars on nuclear weapons was a folly. And they did what Kennedy had tried to do before he was assassinated. Kennedy had tried to end the arms race and had a personal relationship with Khrushchev after realising, you know, how close the world had come in Cuba to a terrible tragedy. He was going to, you know, do what Gorbachev and Reagan did, sign the peace treaty, and Thatcher, way back in the 60s. Just think how different world history would have been. But that was why he was assassinated. It was a coup, it was an assassination by the military intelligence apparatus. And this is revealed in many, many books. I have a interest in Kennedy's assassination because I think it was part of this tragedy whereby military elite intelligence anti-peace factions take power. It happened then in America, and I think it's happening in the Brexit coup, which is what's happening. The same types are trying to engineer this thing. They don't want peace, they don't want a Europe living at peace, because they thrive on militarism and war and conflict and chaos. And it's very interesting that the chief architect, in many ways, Steve Bannon, of the people that we know, is an American military officer. I mean, sort of ex-intelligence American captain in the military, Cold War warrior. For him, it's a military exercise to do Brexit and bring about the destruction of the UK he's a man of low intellect, hasn't realised the consequence, and the fact that he's partly of Irish ancestry makes me ashamed, because what his work is doing is going to bring turmoil and catastrophe to Ireland. But he doesn't see that, he doesn't understand that, and it's tragedy. So what we have then is Sheva Nazi, one of these world leaders. I've been going into detail. I mean, this is a huge work. It's a 900-page, 2-volume book I'm doing. First time any historians looked at 9/11. And I'm doing it in honour of Marcus Cunliffe, who was one of my great heroes as a boy. When I wanted to become a historian, he was the father of my then best friend, Jason Cunliffe, and we used to go to his house in Sussex Square and Lewis Crescent, and he was the first real historian I'd met, Marcus, and he ended up teaching at the University of Washington, DC, and he was an expert on George Washington. He'd written books. He was the first pioneer of American studies in the UK. Marcus is dead, sadly. He inspired me with the idea of, hey, this history thing is really interesting, isn't it? And then I've met subsequently many historians, some of whom were my teachers when I did my degree at the University of London in history, and I specialised in world history. Of course, me being me, I wanted to study everything, all history, of all places, of all times. So I'm an omnivorous universal historian. Well, that's fine. You probably gather that. But that's why 9/11 is such an interesting subject. And in my studies, I'm looking at Sheva Nazi, and I'm discovering that I think almost certainly didn't have full knowledge, or he would have told. He was a man of ethics and integrity. And towards the end of his life, he was baptized into the Georgian church, the Georgian Orthodox Church, which, I've done a bit of research on, and it turns out the Georgian church was the second earliest country in the world to become Christian. The Armenian were the first, and then the Georgians, and it was evangelized by a woman called Saint Nino, who I've been reading, who was from Cappadocia, which is a part of Turkey I love. I've been to Cappadocia. It's near where Rumi is buried, in Konya. And dear old Saint Nino, she did what Patrick did in Ireland, Nino did in Georgia, right? Actually 100 years before Patrick. She'd taken the gospel, the teachings, this archetypal clash of good and evil, the Tiberius thinking versus the love thinking of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, the dyadic, love that we should be living by, instead of this tortured, sadomasochistic, cruelty of violence and sex. That's not love. What Tiberius was doing wasn't love. It was hatred and eros all wrapped up in a toxic brew. And so Nino took the gospel to Georgia, and it's still there. I mean, Georgia is still a Christian country, in spite of having been conquered by many different invaders over the centuries. And Sheva Nazi, towards the end of his life, he'd never been baptized. He'd been a communist. He eventually was baptized into the Georgian Orthodox Church, and I just think that's rather sweet, and I wanted to share that because even to this day, it's the most common name for Georgian girls, right, to be called Nino or some variant of it. Here we are, like 1700 years after that woman, Nino, took this teaching to Georgia. All the girls, it's their most common name. Just like in Ireland, lots of the boys are called Patrick, and the same in America and Britain, wherever Irish have gone. So, I think that shows that what happened at that time of Christ, and in that confrontation and so on, and in that, somehow that miraculous rebirth that happened, that triumphing over death, Christians call it resurrection. It's a mystery, but it was apocastasis. It was the beginning of a sign that death ultimately can't hold spiritual truth. The seer is immortal, in a sense, is what Valmiki and all the sages of India also affirm. Truth is eternal, and as St. John said, the darkness cannot hold it. I feel about Brexit that because it's the truth, it will eventually win. The lies, the darkness, the deceits of the people trying to destroy the United Kingdom through their dark arts, and there are many more clues now emerging about the trails of money and so on, will be exposed, and they will end up in court, and there will be people going to prison over it all. But the light lives on, Okay, I want to move on now, and I want to just address a difficult question, because I kind of lament, I wonder, and I'm going to share some honest stuff here, it's not necessarily easy, but where is the Queen in all this? I mean, I have met the Queen, not personally to talk to, but I've been to events she's been at, and I set up the Commonwealth Interfaith Network, of which she's the head of the Commonwealth, so she knows about my work, and we have corresponded, and I have had more to do with her husband, Duke of Edinburgh. I lament, I'm concerned for the Queen, because I respect her. I'm an Anglican Christian, she's the head of my church. I believe she's a profound and deep Christian, and she must be surely pulling her hair out. Because her kingdom is about to be broken up over this Brexit. And what I wrote to her, and I said in my last correspondence, because she wrote back to me saying, well, I can't do anything about Brexit because I'm a constitutional monarch. That's not true, and I've written back to her to point this out. I mean, this is extraordinary. Why would, one wouldn't normally do this kind of thing if it was normal times, right? But, she is, at the end of the day, just another person like us. And so I've pointed out that actually she does have a constitutional duty to not pass legislation that she knows to be the detriment of her own country. I mean, it's a very interesting question in constitutional law whether a sovereign can commit treason against themselves. Because I would argue that if she authorises Brexit and the self-destruction of the UK, she's committing treason against herself, because it will lead to the self-destruction of the country. I think that she can, and I think that monarchs have to be held to account by the bigger picture of the constitutional history of a given nation. I think there's a bit of an anomaly in British law in that one swears an oath of personal allegiance to the monarch, and that's how the Privy Council works. I think that oath needs to be changed, and it's an oath to the Constitution and to the nation as a whole, of which the monarch is sovereign, fine, but she's a constitutional sovereign, who is therefore accountable to law like all of us. And I would say, I mean, I intend, if I ever manage, and had an interview with her, which I would like very much, I will ask her point blank, did you, for example, have pre-knowledge of 9/11 when Tony Blair came to you and said, we're going to war against Iraq? Did you say, Tony, is that wise? Why are we doing that? Didn't we used to run that country as a rather civilized country? Didn't we? And what's this got to do with 9/11? Did she ask Tony Blair the right questions? And if not, why not? If you look into the constitutional duty of a monarch, Walter Baycott, who's a great expert on this, and he's the Bible for parliamentary and constitutional procedure, he says the monarch has a duty to advise. The Prime Minister doesn't have to listen, but she does have a duty to give counsel and advice, and all I've done is ask her to exercise that duty by advising Theresa May to back off Brexit. But she doesn't seem to be doing